America is still, and of course we're going to keep track of everything that's happening in at the Capitol if anything new emerges, but as of now they're adjourned until tomorrow morning. America is still reeling, however, after the nation's capital was attacked by domestic terrorists last week. Now comes the difficult task of identifying exactly who stormed the building. Many rioters were seen in combat helmets, body armor, and other tactical gear, making it even more challenging to figure out who those people are. So for more on this, let's bring in John Scott-Railton. He's a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School. Shout out to the University of Toronto, where I went. So thank you so much for joining us. So this has been very interesting. Yeah, certainly a lot of people were wearing combat gear, but a lot of them kind of live streamed what they were doing. They tweeted out to friends, and you know, we've talked earlier about they didn't seem to have a concept that what they were doing may actually land them, you know, in court. But you helped to identify the Air Force combat veteran that was seen holding zip ties on the Senate floor. The zip ties, I think, were particularly disturbing to many people because we all wondered, well, what was your plan? Why do you have zip ties with you? What about this particular rider caught your attention?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me and for focusing on this important topic. It absolutely caught my attention the way that it did for millions of others. Here was a man who looked comfortable wearing military gear and had a clutch of these temporary restraints, also known as zip tie handcuffs, in his hand. And as soon as I saw that image, my reaction was, okay, we urgently need to find out what this man's plan was. But to do that, we're going to have to figure out who he is. He didn't make it impossible. Remarkably, this gentleman wore a series of patches on his body armor that were kind of like his personal CV, connecting him to Texas, but also to his former military unit.
So how concerning was it to see ex-military personnel involved in this? And there is some reporting that even at least one active duty military officer took part in the insurrection who has subsequently resigned or commissioned. Do you think that we'll see more?
I think we're going to see more. I think the thing that we're discovering here is that the ideology that brought people into the Capitol building wasn't just ignorance. And if you look at the different folks who are surfacing who were there, we see a lot of former military and people with law enforcement connections, which I think is troubling in many ways because it seems to be in direct contradiction to the oath that we think that they have sworn for their country. I think it's going to require a lot of stock taking in the armed forces, but also in communities of veterans to understand how things went so sideways.
A lot of the riders wore masks or, you know, stuff on their face, whether it was just makeup, making it a little tougher to identify them through pictures and video. But I'm wondering if there's a workaround when it comes to that. Are they still identifiable?
So we did a workaround. And when I say we, it's a combination of me and about, I don't know, several tens of thousands of folks on Twitter. When I saw the first photographs of an individual completely covered from head to toe in camouflage carrying restraints, this is a different gentleman than the retired lieutenant colonel we're talking about, I immediately put it on Twitter and began the process of trying to solicit clues to identify this person. Remarkably, that process worked. It did so because we moved slow, and we tried to decide what each specific element of clothing was, and then we moved from there to finding other footage of the person, and from there to finding footage of him with an exposed face, and from there moving to identification. What you pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, there were a lot of live streamers and a lot of people taking pictures, because for every person who was there with a plan or with a specific intent, there were a lot of people who just had high definition video that they put out online. And a lot of us are now using that video to try to figure out who these people are and where they came from.
Yeah, and some things that others have noted, John, which is that some of these people weren't that smart. There was one dude who was caught because he had his work ID on his like he was wearing his work ID badge while he's overrunning the United States Capitol. There's another dude and several others who had military patches, some identifying the units that they had served in if they were no longer in the military, and others. And they had a variety of decals, and they were wearing things that just somebody who's an amateur sleuth could figure out who they were, at least get a good sense of where they came from in the country. And if you're talking about people who are professionals like yourself or law enforcement, wasn't very hard to track these folks down. So I'm going to believe that this is going to be one of the first, insurrections in modern times where there is just so much video. In other countries, when things like this happen, it's usually under the cover of darkness, or it's in a country where there are not, 10,000 camera crews around that can rush to film what is happening. And here, what's happened with this insurrection has made it probably a little easier for law enforcement than in perhaps other instances that have happened in other places.
Well, I think it's a good point. Every kind of social movement is becoming increasingly visible online, which is something that we all need to be aware of, which is we leave an amazing trail of digital exhaust right now as we move through the world. And there are deep privacy implications that are worthy of another conversation. What's clear here is that this is, in so many ways, the biggest event of its kind in the United States, and there are now an overwhelming number of eyeballs working their way through the information that was collected. And I want to give a shout out to some of the organizations like Bellingcat that have spent years doing this in other countries and other country contexts, and who are now, like me, discovering that tools that we've used for years are suddenly relevant very much at home. And I have to just say on a personal note, that's a very disturbing thing. I've spent a lot of time looking at protests and things overseas. To suddenly see it in places and rooms where I've been, this is really strange.
You're a professional at this, but it just occurred to me that, kind of all of America now has sort of started investigating the images that they've seen from the Capitol and other big incidents. But, I'm thinking about the Boston Marathon, right? That when you have thousands of people kind of being investigators, is there a concern that the wrong people will be identified and there may be legal problems because of that?
Well, there could be more than legal problems. Misidentification causes lasting harm, and we know that from the Boston bombing cases. What I think a lot of people tried to do in this situation was to really get people who were helping to differentiate between surfacing clues and making statements about identity, and really trying to do conclusive identification. Ultimately, for example, it was my decision that after I achieved a high degree of confidence identifying both Lieutenant Colonel Brock, who's of course retired, but also the other individual known as Zip Tie Guy, I forwarded that directly to law enforcement and didn't go public with those things until there was substantially more evidence that it was them. In the case of Lieutenant Colonel Brock, I reached out to well-known journalist Ronan Farrow, who spent with me more than 24 hours calling people up and trying to get firsthand identifications. And ultimately, Ronan actually got this retired lieutenant colonel on the phone who admitted to being there. And only after that was I comfortable saying, okay, folks, here's his name.
Yeah, he had an excuse for why he was there, and that he didn't. It was a fascinating piece of investigative reporting that you both did there. And the thing, John, is what is becoming evident, as we mentioned earlier, is the fact that a lot of these people were proudly displaying their faces on camera, live streaming it, wearing things that identified them to law enforcement. It actually makes me nervous that if there are people, we're talking about the inauguration, for example, who are really motivated and who really know what they're doing, and who aren't like ignoramuses, that they would not show their face, that they would not wear any identifying clothing. That could be more dangerous if you're talking about a group of people who could film themselves overrunning the U.S. Capitol. What happens if you are just a little bit smarter than these individuals and you're not wearing some of the things that allowed you and others to identify them?
Well, there are people who were smarter. people who covered every inch of their bodies, who wore gloves over scarves, over face masks. And we are still, in some cases, banging our collective heads against the problem of identifying them. In some cases, I'm confident we'll get there with time. I think it's really important to say, as I've been working through this, I've got kind of different categories of people who are there. There were the Instagram tourists. I'm not interested in them. There were people who were in there shouting, not so interested in them. I'm interested in three categories. Categories of people who are clearly there and did violence against police officers, against other people there, or against the historical treasures that are in the Capitol. People who appear to be lone wolves with some kind of military intent, who are kitted out either because they actually have a military background or because they're having the play acting time of their lives. And then the third group, which is men who moved and communicated in groups, who wore military and paramilitary style outfits. Those are the people we need to be concerned with, in part because many of them went back from the Capitol to their homes and took away the message, wow, look what we can accomplish.
Yeah.
And right now, what is keeping me up every night, the reason I had bad sleep last night, is because I've been looking at their messages and their posts, and they want a round two, and they want it on a bigger scale. And this time, they're going to bring their weapons.
So, this time we're looking ahead at the President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. I know there was some talk about something happening on the 17th. The inauguration is on the 20th. When you describe someone who's deliberately covered from head to toe, layering up covering their face so that they can't be identified, this is not, a spontaneous expression of anger. This is a deliberately planned, executing a plan. Based on what you've observed in the crowd, and there are many people, and sometimes people who are just spontaneously having an outburst can also be very, very dangerous. But how can U.S. officials better prepare for, the inauguration or anything else that might be coming up in the next few days?
Well, on that topic, I think we're not giving enough focus to the pipe bombs, which didn't have their own Instagram accounts, and so we don't see a lot of pictures of them. That, to me, is bone-chilling, which is there were people who came there with a plan to blow things up, perhaps as a diversion. We don't know what the plan A was, if those were diversion. We desperately need to do everything that we can to help law enforcement figure out who on earth those people were and what their next plan is. It sounds like they may still be at large. Moving forward, I think there's going to be a stock taking, two kinds. First, understanding what was it in these ideologies that led men and women, in some cases who'd sworn an oath to defend our country, to do these absolutely dishonorable things. We have to understand that. We also have to do a, I think, 9/11 Commission style understanding of how things went so horribly wrong with security and with preparation. And I'm going to flag that as a person who works in cybersecurity and privacy, I am deeply concerned that this moment will be turned into calls once more to break encryption.
So, John, so here's the thing, John Scott. What is striking to me is what you were talking about with regards to how some people came kitted out, to use your words. And it makes me wonder, as I listen to you and as I see the reporting that's coming out about these individuals who participated in this, why would you be kitted out in the way that you were? Why would you bring those zip ties that are used to restrain people if you thought you were just going to protest the Electoral College result? If you were just going to be peacefully exercising your First Amendment right to assemble and to have your views known by picketing or by marching around holding a banner. When you get a congressman like James Clyburn who goes on national television and says that, that he's talking to some of his colleagues about whether, and they're investigating whether or not this could be an inside job, when you start to see some of the evidence of the people who participated, it does make you wonder what's going on there. What did they know? What did they prepare for that perhaps maybe, your common Joe Blow was not prepared for? He was just there because, he was there to rally, but there were probably some individuals who weren't there for that, and that's very sort of disconcerting.
You're absolutely right. That is very disconcerting. And I think, I'm no forensic psychologist, and it's going to take us a long time to understand what the specific motivations and choices were and where, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Brock got his restraints. That said, We know that people came to the Capitol, walked up to it, carrying restraints in their, armor plating, carrying it in their body armor. What on earth did they plan? I think we really urgently need to find out. We do have some clues. QAnon movement and other Stop the Steal groups, in some cases, believed that the Capitol building was going to be the site of a major event, perhaps involving an action by Pence, perhaps dragging representatives and members of Congress outside, perhaps a trial. I think the rhetoric and the ideology there were for all to see. And what I, in retrospect, wish we hadn't done was laugh about how wild and psychotic a lot of it sounded. Because while it was nuts, it seems to have motivated people. A lot of that stuff was a cocked and loaded rhetorical gun pointed at the Capitol building.
I think one of the things, John Scott, that we've been sort of absorbing over the last couple of days is as there's more reporting, as there's an identification of who these individuals were that participated in this, it's starting to settle in. I think back on Wednesday, in real time, everybody was like, holy cow, look what's going on. Even for the reporters who are there, you only have a limited view. You've done this, Anne-Marie, I've done it. John Scott, you perhaps have reported from instances like this where you are only able to sort of describe what's happening around you. You don't have a really big picture understanding of what's going on beyond your line of vision until several days later. And now I think we're starting to understand the enormity of what took place on that day. I think lawmakers are starting to understand the enormity of what took place that day. And what's remarkable is you're still seeing discussions, you're still seeing people who are elected officials still peddling the lies that President Trump and his sycophants peddled to the American people, which ultimately led these individuals to take the actions that we saw on Wednesday. He told them the election was rigged. He then, afterwards, the lie grew. It wasn't just that the election was rigged. It was that he won by a landslide. He won Congress, he said in that conversation to Georgia election officials, which was not true. And all of that is still being talked about by some members of Congress and some members of the United States Senate. So, we're not out of the woods yet. We're not out of the woods yet. John Scott-Railton, thank you very much for your reporting. Thank you so much for what you do. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and to the many people who helped me.
Appreciate it.